Welcome to General Biology. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 9. So we're just going to go ahead and get started with this. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, here we go. So on Monday, we did Chapter 8, and we covered microscopic organisms, so archaea and bacteria and viruses. And today we're going to talk more about biodiversity, fungus, and plants. Fungi is plural. Okay, so fungi are eukaryotes. They're very diverse. There are over 120,000 different species. And fungi decompose dead organisms, or as I like to say, they eat dead and decaying matter. They are decomposers, and they break down large molecules and absorb the resulting small molecules as nutrients. We just started Chapter 9, William. Okay, there is a wide variety of fungi, both helpful and harmful. One that is helpful, penicillin, is a mold, so it's a fungus, and it is an antibiotic, a well-known antibiotic. Yeast is used to leaven bread or raise bread, which gives the bread those bubbles inside, makes it rise. But there is also bread mold, which spoils food, which is the bane of my existence. Then some more harmful organisms, athlete's foot is caused by a fungus. And then in addition, you can also eat fungi as a food source. So a little bit about the structure of fungus. They consist of structures both above ground and below ground. Below ground, the mycelium, which is this section here, digests food, breaks down food into smaller molecules that can be then taken in and used by the fungus. Above ground is the actual mushroom, which is the part that you can actually see. And it produces spores for reproduction. The spores are produced on the underside of that cap of the mushroom. Both parts of the fungi are made up of fibers called hyphae. Fungi have the ability to reproduce sexually or asexually. So in asexual reproduction, spores are made, so as I mentioned before, at the bottom underside of that cap, and they contain a haploid set of chromosomes, so a single set, and they're produced on the underside of that mushroom cap. The spores are released, and then they germinate and produce new haploid mycelium. So with spores, those are haploid, and they produce haploid fungi. So fungi also have the ability to reproduce sexually when two parents come together. Haploid cells of two hyphae fuse and form diploid cells. These diploid cells then are going to be able to divide and produce genetically distinct offspring, or haploid spores. And here is an example of a fungus called a stinkhorn, and it attracts flies, and these flies help disperse spores to other areas. Okay, moving on to plants. They are eukaryotes as well and have unique adaptations for survival on land. So plants about 500 million years ago, they began to evolve adaptations for being able to survive on land. A plant is terrestrial, so it's on land, terrestrial multicellular eukaryote that has the ability to carry out photosynthesis. And with photosynthesis, they're able to create their own food from the carbon dioxide and oxygen and water. Those are their starting products for photosynthesis. So plants have adaptations that allow them to survive on land. They have a shoot system, and this is where you have the actual shoots of the plant that is above ground and is photosynthetic, and it exposes the plant to light, which is necessary for photosynthesis, and air. Then you have the root system, and this is what you see, what is below ground, and this is where your roots are. And the roots help anchor the plant to the soil and also allows the plant to take in minerals and water from the soil. Okay, in addition, there are more adaptations, the production of pollen. This protects sperm, it allows it to be carried by the wind or animals. This is the sex cell or the sperm of the flower, the pollen. Then there's also the egg or the oocyte. It remains in the female flower and it allows the developing embryo or seed to develop within the mother's body. So hopefully, I can't remember if we have a better picture coming up. No. So let me see if I can draw this real quick. So here we have some petals. And sometimes you'll see a structure kind of like this at the base of the flower. So here's more petals. The eggs form inside the ovary of the flower. And so that enlarged base there would be the ovary. And then you would have pollen up here. Okay. More adaptations that allow plants to develop on land and thrive on land. They have a vascular system. So a network of tubes that transport water, nutrients, and sugar throughout the plant. Then, in addition, leaves have a cuticle or a waxy coating that helps protect against water loss. And you'll find that in more dry, arid environments, the leaves of plants are going to have even a thicker cuticle because they need to protect the plant even more because it's in a dry, arid environment. So you'd see that from where I'm from in California. Leaves, adaptation for terrestrial life. This is the main site of photosynthesis and gas exchange. So if you remember, gas exchange occurs on the underside of leaves through the stoma, those little openings that take in carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. Then in addition, there is lignin, and this is a chemical you find in the cell walls of plants, and it helps stiffen them and helps make the plant stronger and give it more support and stand upright. Okay, there is a symbiotic relationship between plants and fungi. So together, fungi and plant roots form a symbiotic relationship called mycorrhizae. The fungus provides plant with water and minerals that it absorbs from the soil, so it helps the plant get what it needs. And the plant, in exchange, provides sugar that it has produced through photosynthesis, and that fungus is able to use the sugar for nourishment. So this is a good example of a symbiotic relationship where both benefit. Okay, where does the mass of the plant come from? As a plant grows, the bulk of the mass, where does it come from? So this is something to think about. Maybe this will be our attendance question. The hint, use the equation for photosynthesis to answer the question. So I think I will make this our attendance question and make it two-part, write down the equation for photosynthesis, and then answer where does that bulk come from. So look for that shortly after class today. So here is the equation. So all you have to do is copy it down and then tell me where does the mass or where's the bulk of the plant? Where would you find the bulk of the plant? Okay, so the roots of the plant anchor it to soil, absorb water, absorb nutrients, and transport to other parts of the plant, and it also helps store food. So a great example of storing food would be with, I think this is a, I just forgot the name of it. But anyways, this is a tuber, and that stores food, and it's a sweet tuber. Okay, the shoots of the plant are what is above ground. There are different parts of shoots that include the stem and the leaves and the structures for reproduction, like the cones and the flowers. So the shoot system is everything above ground. The roots, on the other hand, oops, I went the wrong way. Okay, so more about the shoots. Some unique structures, terminal bud, which is the most farthest away or the most recent bud to form. Forms at the tip of the stem, and it helps increase exposure to the plant to sunlight. The flower is the reproductive structure of the plant. Other types of plants have different structures that they use, but with flowers, with plants that have flowers, that is the reproductive structure. Leaves, primary site of photosynthesis and gas exchange for the plant. The petiole is the stalk, so the stalk that holds the leaf. Okay, so that would be the petiole. The blade is the flattened part of the leaf, or this ugly part that I drew right here would be the blade. And then the stem, remember all of this is a shoot, because the shoot is everything above ground. The stem grows above ground and supports the leaves and the flowers, so everything branches off of the stems. Okay, plant bodies are organized into a structural hierarchy. Plant cells work together to form tissues. Same way with human bodies, our cells come together and form tissues. Tissues join together to form organs, and then can be organized into tissue systems. So there is a hierarchy level of organization of plants, just as we see in animals. Looking at unique structures of a plant cell, some of the unique structures you won't find with an animal cell. Cell wall, thick, hardened cell wall that helps provide structure to the plant. A central vacuole, this bubble-shaped structure inside the cell, contains water or fluid, and it helps maintain rigidity of the plant. Plasmodesmata, these little pores, and these are channels that connect the cells, little channels from cell to cell, so you have cellular communication between those cells. So right here, you can see it showing you a cross-section of that channel. Then in addition, chloroplast. Chloroplast you're not going to find typically in animal cells. Okay, two specific types of tissues that are important with plants is the xylem and the phloem. So knowing the difference between xylem and phloem is important. So with phloem, you're transporting sugars from where they're made to other parts of the plant, so to roots or to shoots. The xylem is transporting water and dissolved minerals from the roots to the shoots. So the xylem is traveling upwards. The phloem can go both ways, okay? And they transport different things. So you would need to know what phloem transports, what xylem transports, what direction does the fluid flow in xylem and in phloem. Okay, plant tissues come together to form organs. So several types of plant tissues that work together and carry out a specific function are considered to be organs. And it could be easily confused when we think about an organ in our body. It's the distinct structure that carries out a function. Well, using that same definition, you can have organs in plants. So for example, a leaf is a plant organ for photosynthesis. It has both xylem and phloem, those thin little tubes that carry dissolved nutrients and water and sugar. Other plant organs include roots and stems. Okay, plant tissues are organized into 3 tissue systems. You need to know the 3 main tissue systems. You have the dermal tissue system. I'm sorry, one sec here. Dermal tissue system performs that outer coating, outer protective covering, and it regulates gas exchange because you have stoma on the underside of the leaf, like right here and right here, where you have carbon dioxide entering and oxygen leaving. Then you have the ground tissue system. This is where photosynthesis occurs, and it provides structural support for the plant. And then third, you have the vascular tissue system, and this is where you have your xylem and your phloem. Okay, looking at the evolutionary history of plants, there are 4 major groups of modern plants. There are bryophytes, seedless vascular plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So this charophyte is an algae, and it can resemble its algal ancestors to all land plants that lived at that time. So a common ancestor that was aquatic. So let's look at these four major groups and the evolution of them. So the evolution of a waxy outer layer, which is your, can't remember. I just forgot, never mind. I can't remember the name of it. Please forgive me. So that outer waxy layer helps protect against water loss. However, bryophytes, so bryophytes are still dependent on water for reproduction. So those are, we would consider the least evolved of plants would be the bryophytes, or the ones that arised first in history. Then there is the origin of vascular tissue, which comes next and allows plants to have cell walls and grow taller because they have that structural support. Then you have the evolution of seeds. That came next, and that's what gymnosperms refer to, as they produce seeds. And it helps eliminate the plant's need to reproduce near water, and so that allows plants to live in new habitats. Then lastly is the evolution of flowers. That came last, and that allowed plants to essentially dominate the land. So if we went in order from least complex to most complex, and which came first in evolutionary history, right here, it goes bryophytes, seedless vascular plants, gymnosperms, and then angiosperms. So a little bit about bryophytes. These are seedless, non-vascular plants. They do have adaptations for land. They have that waxy outer layer that helps them protect against water loss. They have structures that allow the production of gametes and embryos, but they lack seeds and they lack vascular tissue. And modern bryophytes can survive only in watery environments. So they have not completely evolved to be independent of water like other plants. So a great example of a bryophyte would be moss. So bryophytes come in two distinct forms, and that represents, they have two generations, alternating generations. So first you have spores that are produced by sporophyte cells, and these are haploid and they are able to survive in harsh conditions. Unlike most plants, bryophytes also have a gametophyte phase, and it is also haploid, and that phase is dominant. So the spore phase and the gametophyte phase. The gametophyte phase is dominant. So if we looked at this life cycle, I'm sorry, my dog is barking. Let's say we start with the gametophyte. The gametophyte is haploid. We want to remember that. Undergoes mitosis and produces haploid sperm and egg cells. Undergoes fertilization, you get a zygote, which is diploid. That diploid zygote develops into a diploid sporophyte. That sporophyte produces spores. So spore production. Spores are haploid, and when they germinate, produces the next life cycle of the gametophyte. Okay, vascular tissue was an important evolutionary adaptation. All plants except for bryophytes, because bryophytes came first evolutionary speaking, they are not as developed as other plants. So all other plants except for bryophytes have vascular tissue. They have the xylem and the phloem. Phloem primarily transports sugar, so that's the main thing that phloem transports, and it transports sugar from where they're made and to where they're stored in other parts of the plant. It's a parsnip. So it could be stored in this root system, the sugar sink, can also be stored partly in leaves, but not as much in the root system. Phloem sap always flows from the sugar source to a sugar sink. Xylem, on the other hand, is what is transporting water and minerals from the roots to the rest of the plant. And it is made of dead cells, and they're like tiny little pipes, or like a capillary tube, very thin and small. And the sap in xylem is moving upwards against gravity, and it's moving upwards through the process we'd call transpiration. What happens is water is evaporating from the leaves in the tree. So let's see if I can draw. So we have a leaf. This is the underside of our leaf, and we have our stoma. Okay, these are our stoma. And we have carbon dioxide going in. We have oxygen leaving and water leaving those leaves through the stoma, okay? And so when water leaves and is evaporated from the leaves of the plant, it helps pull the water up from the root system. Okay, so those tiny pores called stoma or stomata help with the transpiration, because as I just showed you, you have carbon dioxide going in, oxygen leaving, and water leaving. So during the day, the stoma is open, you have that evaporation and transpiration that occurs, pulling the xylem up from the roots. But at night, the guard cells close, closing the stoma, and that prevents more gas exchange and water loss overnight. Side note, there are some plants that switch this process and close their stoma during the day and open it during night. Those are, you're going to find these types of plants in hot, arid environments where they really want to protect against water loss. Okay, moving on to seedless vascular plants. These have important adaptations for living on land, one being vascular tissue and having that lignin in the cell walls that help harden the cell walls and give it structure. So a fern is a great example of a seedless vascular plant. And here's a quick anatomy of the fern. You have the vascular tissue, which is the leaf essentially of the fern, of the frond. Lignin makes those stems nice and hard. Then you have a root system. There is also a gametophyte phase. And ferns produce spores on the underside of their leaves. Okay, so ferns have a two-part life cycle too, where they have a gametophyte phase and a sporophyte phase. So you'll need to know this. So in the gametophyte phase, let's see, the gametophyte is going to be haploid. Undergoes mitosis, produces gametes, so egg and sperm, have fertilization, and form a diploid zygote. That diploid zygote forms into a diploid sporophyte, which is the plant, the fern that we physically see. And that sporophyte fern plant produces spores on the underside of the leaves. Those spores are haploid. They divide through mitosis and produce the next generation of gametophyte. Okay, gymnosperms. So gymnosperms were the first plants to evolve seeds within cones. So a seed is an embryo that has food supply and a protective coating. Seeds are one of the key adaptations that allowed plants to spread across land, and there are many ways to disperse seeds. So looking at a quick anatomy of a gymnosperm, a plant producing, oh my goodness, sorry, a seed producing plant that in cones. You have a woody stem. Typically there are needles for leaves, produces pollen, and I can't see that little part there. And then the pollen producing cone produces pollen, and then you also have another type of cone that has the egg cells of the gymnosperm. Okay, looking at some different types of gymnosperms, conifers, so pine trees, those that produce cones. Cycads are a tropical plant that are gymnosperms. Bristlecone pines, which are very old, gnarled pine trees, typically found in kind of harsher environments. And redwoods, which are the tallest trees in the world. If you're talking about coastal redwoods, they are the tallest. Okay, gymnosperms reproduce with two types of cones. So make sure you pay attention to this. So let us start with our germination, okay? So we have a gymnosperm that is growing. It produces two types of cones, a pollen-producing cone and an ovule-producing cone. Pollen is released, and within that female cone, the pollen meet up with the egg, fertilize the egg, you have a zygote form, which then matures into a seed. And then that seed is planted or dispersed and produces a new plant. So this is a type of sexual reproduction in plants because you're using sperm and egg. The pollen is the sperm. Okay. What are plants good for? So actually, I think this might be your question. I highlighted it because I think I wanted to use this one. So scratch that. This will be your question. So what are 3 ways that organisms or products of these organisms impact our lives? Plants. So name both positive and negative impacts. So that's going to be our attendance question. Yes, I highlighted it. That's what we're going to use. Okay, moving to angiosperms. You find this all over modern landscape, and the vast majority of modern plants are angiosperms, or otherwise known flowering plants. Okay, so a flower is a very complex reproductive structure that houses the ovary that will develop into either fruit or seed, or fruit and seed essentially, because the seed will be inside the fruit. So some typical anatomy of an angiosperm, you have a leaf, stem, roots, axillary bud, which is branching off from a bud coming from a branch, and then a flower. Flower is one of those key things that you find with angiosperms. Oh, I went the wrong way. Okay, so some examples of angiosperms, coconut palms. Ooh, and coconuts are so good. Melon cactus, grass, and beans. In fact, tomatoes from your garden and squash from your garden, those are angiosperms. So there are 2 groups of angiosperms. You need to know the 2 main groups, monocots and dicots, and they're different in their anatomy. So with monocots, we're looking at monocots first. There's one cotyledon, which is the first leaf from a sprouting plant. Fibrous root system, leaf veins that are parallel, so note that those veins run parallel to each other. That's a characteristic of a monocot. And then floriparts usually occur in multiples of 3. So there's 3 petals here and 3 petals here. With a dicot, you have 2 cotyledons, so 2 leaves that are formed. So for example, my squash is a dicot because it had 2 cotyledons when it branched and when it germinated. You will usually find a taproot, leaves that are, leaf veins that are branched, so branching off of each other. So you get this branch structure instead of parallel veins. And then floriparts that usually occur in multiples of 4 or 5. And so this flower has 5 petals. So those are some differences between monocots and dicots. So you need to make sure you remember this. Okay. Flowers, fruit, and seeds help angiosperm reproduction. So the flower is the reproductive organ of the plant, of the angiosperm. Flowers produce and receive pollen, so they do both. And the flower structure houses the developing embryo down at the base of the flower here, which when it is fully developed, it will eventually be dispersed as a seed. So looking at the anatomy of the flower, you have petals, stamen, which is this little filament here that has the pollen on it, sepals, stigma and style, the ovary down below, and the ovule, which is a single egg. So if we look even closer at the ovary, what happens is pollen, we're talking about reproduction, pollen from the stamen lands onto the stigma of the ovule, of the ovary. The anther is what releases that pollen. The pollen travels down this pollen tubule to fertilize that egg, and then you have the formation of a zygote, which will be diploid, because the sperm is haploid and the egg is haploid. Okay, so the sperm carrying pollen is the male gametophyte. So sometimes you have male flowers and female flowers, and sometimes you have the male and female parts together. So a seed is the embryonic plant, or the embryo of that germination that occurred, of that fertilization that occurred. So the seed is made of a dormant embryonic plant. You can see that right there, that dormant embryonic plant, and the endosperm, which is everything else of that seed. And that's the food supply that is absorbed during germination. This is what we eat when we eat peas and when we eat beans and we eat peanuts. We're eating the endosperm, essentially, of that seed. Okay, so there's the cotyledon, the first embryonic leaves, then there's the endosperm. So both gymnosperms and angiosperms have seeds, but they are different in other ways. So you need to make sure you know what makes gymnosperms different than angiosperms. Okay, looking at fruit, after fertilization, the ovary may expand and thicken and form this protective coating, which we would call the fruit. And very often the fruit is nice and tasty, and we love to eat it. So, question to think about, how is a fruit different from a nut? Want to take a stab at it, William? Oh.
I don't know. A nut might be harder than a fruit.
That's true. Yeah. Right. And another difference would be the seeds have that endosperm, whereas the fruit doesn't, that bulk around the seed is not endosperm. That's actually the ovary itself that is expanded to make the fruit. So a little bit different structure there. Thank you. Okay, how would you age a Sequoiadendron giganteum, or a giant sequoia? So one of the biggest trees in the world in girth, so the trunk itself is the giant sequoia, and the largest giant sequoia in the world is found in I think it's found in Sequoia National Park in California. They can grow to almost 300 feet tall, but what's really impressive about these is the girth of the trunk can be 79 feet in circumference. It is huge. People in the 1800s used to cut down sequoias and use the trunk as a dance floor. I'm not kidding. It was so big. We did lose a lot of giant sequoias, unfortunately, in the 1800s to logging. Okay, so question to think about. If we know a sequoia adds 1 centimeter to its girth each year, how could we age that tree? So we could extrapolate that if it's growing 1 centimeter a year, we would assume that each year it's growing 1 centimeter, and we could extrapolate the age based on how long it took to grow that big. There are pros and cons to that type of aging. The biggest con or the criticism I have of that is that trees do not grow consistently every year. Sometimes they grow faster and sometimes they grow slower, depending on the environmental conditions and the availability of nutrients. So it's not the most accurate way to measure the age of a tree. Okay, flowering plants can be grouped into 3 basic categories based on lifespans. So annuals they live 1 year, 1 season. Biennials grow for 2 seasons, and then perennials will grow for many seasons. So all the plants in your garden would be annuals, or a lot of the flowers that you'd buy at the store would be annuals. Perennials, a good example would be the trees we have outside. Those grow for many years, and I can't give you a good example of a biennial. I'm not that good at plants. Just going to be honest about that. So biennials, okay, here we go. Biennials, a good example would be carrots. Okay, so the first season they produce those tubers, the carrots that we think about. But if you leave them in the ground and do not harvest them, the next year they flower and produce seeds. Perennials live for many years, and then every spring, typically, they're going to flower and produce fruit of some sort. So, a sequoia tree, would that be an annual or a perennial? Think about that for a second. Sequoia trees live for a long time, for multiple seasons, so it would be a perennial. Okay, plants can grow in length. The meristem, let's see if it shows the meristem. The meristem region is the bottom portion of the root tip, and this is where growth in length occurs. This is called primary growth. Each year, the meristem produces new layers of cells, and then the old cells die. Then the old cells die. Over the years, these cells that have died accumulate to form wood. This forms growth rings, and those are the patterns between spring and summer cells, where they die and new cells are produced. And this is a really good way to estimate a tree's age, because each ring represents that season change each year. So reality speaking, this is a more accurate way to estimate the age of a tree as compared to just assuming the same rate of growth for every year. Counting the rings is much more accurate. And with that, wow, we are done with our lecture. Let's see. Sorry, 1 second here. I'm trying to get back to. Okay, there we go. All right, William, you are the faithful one. Do you have any questions today about what we've talked about?
Right now, I think I am good.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining today. We're definitely getting done early, which is a plus, gives you some time to do other stuff. Let me double check again on when our next lecture is. I want to say it's tomorrow because we have just a couple days before we're done with this course. It's coming up. It's a big deal. Let me see. I already put the Zoom links on for the rest of the summer class. Just loading it up really quick, double checking our dates. So yes, we do have a Zoom meeting tomorrow on the 25th And so we'll get started into our new chapter, our new section. And we can start with questions with review, and then we'll get started into the new chapter in our last section of general biology. Wow, we were almost done. Okay, thank you so much. I hope you have a great day, and I'm going to post this on YouTube right away. Okay?
Yep.